Hello and welcome. Now I have to confess, although I've said about making videos about National Express, Rapide coaches and indeed Green Line, the thought of making a video on Wallace Arnold never crossed my mind. And in fact it wasn't until a friend I work with who used to be a Wallace Arnold driver lent me a couple of books on Wallace Arnold, thank you very much Ian, I thought that the video might be a good idea. Wallace Arnold was an absolutely massive coaching concern, and their coaches were seen everywhere. I remember as a child seeing them parked in the hoverport at Pegwell Bay, and then we'd go to the Isle of Wight and they'd be parked outside some hotel in Sandown. But then overnight, it seems, the brand disappeared. So what happened to Wallace Arnold? Well, if you watch this video, I will try and shed a little bit of light on that for you. The story of Wallace Arnold starts way back in the early 1900s, when Mr. Wallace Cunningham and Mr. Arnold Crowe started a charabanc company and operated tours. However, into the story enters Robert Barr. Robert Barr grew up on a farm at Woolley near Wakefield. Now, Robert Barr was a man with a vision. Even before entering the haulage and passenger transport industry, he'd seen the conditions that the people were living in and working in the towns and the cities, and wanted to take them out into the countryside and to the coast. In 1904, he moved to Leeds and got a job at Bridge Street Garage in Lower Bridgate, and he had a fascination with all things mechanical. A natural hard worker, he saved a lot of money and managed to buy his first vehicle, which was a carrier, and this was in 1912. Now this carrier must have been a bit of a multi-purpose vehicle, because during the week he used it as a lorry, and at weekends he was running excursions into the Yorkshire Dales. This fledgling company was to become R Bar of Leeds, and it grew very quickly, but this was reduced during World War I. After the war, Robert started getting the company back on track. And as early as 1920, he was running from Leeds to London. Now, considering that the top speed at the time, or the top legal speed, I should say, was 12 miles an hour, and they were running on solid tyres, that must have been quite a journey, mustn't it? 12 miles an hour to get from Leeds to London. How long would that take? It must have taken days. And this is the part of the story where the paths of Wallace Cunningham, Arnold Crowe, and Robert Barr all cross. Robert Barr was looking at expanding his business even more, and decided to speak to Wallace Cunningham and Arnold Crowe to see if they'd be interested in selling their established charabanc company. Yes, they replied, and he paid them £800 for the business. Now, this Wallace Arnold company that he'd just bought actually was already doing tours to London, Edinburgh and the Highlands. Instead of merging the road haulage business with this new acquisition, Robert Barr decided to keep them both separate and kept the name of the haulage company as R Barr of Leeds, whilst the charabanc company kept the name of the previous owners, and that was Wallace Arnold. Now at the time, most charabancs didn't have a roof or any form of protection from the weather, and this certainly wasn't ideal for long tours across the country. It could be really nice and sunny in Leeds. It's not very often, but it could be. But it could be raining in London. And then, of course, there were those tours of the Highlands where anything could happen with the weather. By 1928, Wallace Arnold had moved to all-weather charabancs with roofs and covers on them, and had started to move away from the solid rubber tyres to pneumatic tyres. And this proved to be a very good business move, because the government changed the legislation that vehicles fitted with pneumatic tyres could travel at 20 miles an hour as opposed to the original 12, the 12 mile an hour speed limit being kept for vehicles on solid tyres. Now that doesn't sound a huge difference when you're talking about today's speeds of 65 miles an hour or 100 kilometres on a motorway, but it was virtually doubling the speed limit overnight. And this must have made a massive difference to the times it took to travel on these tours. By 1933, Wallace Arnold were offering continental tours to the top-of-the-range hotels in Europe, and the vehicles they were running were mostly Leylands. However, interestingly, despite being quite a pioneer when it came to moving to all-weather charabancs and moving to pneumatic tyres, the company stuck with petrol engines long after many other companies had switched to diesel engines. Their philosophy was that the petrol engines gave a smoother ride, and petrol engine vehicles lasted in the Wallace Arnold fleet up until 1940. The company was based in the Leeds-Bradford area, but expanded rapidly in the 1930s by acquiring 14 other local operators. And this form of expansion by buying up other operators was something Wallace Arnold would continue to do. In 1937, Robert Barr formed a public company, and this was to become the Barr and Wallace Arnold Trust, and this took over his other transport companies, which covered both the lorries and the coaches. The types of vehicles that were now on offer were much more reliable than the early charabancs of yesteryear, and this allowed Wallace Arnold to introduce more coach tours to places like Devon, Wales and Scotland. Most of the trips before this had been centred on the Yorkshire Dales and the coast. Now obviously during World War II everything stopped, as vehicles were requisitioned by the military and the leisure traffic and touring traffic stopped completely. However, the company did get some contract work for many of the businesses local to its area, including the Avro works. This increased and more second-hand vehicles were required, and this was when Wallace Arnold bought their first double-decker. In 1942, Wallace Arnold also bought a coach builder who was based in Leeds, and this was a very good move because it meant that the company now had people on board with skills to rebuild the fleet after the war. After the restrictions of World War II, there was a huge demand for leisure travel, and car ownership was still incredibly low. In general, the coach industry at the time found this boom rather hard to handle. Again, due to war, there was a shortage of vehicles and of course materials to service the ones that remained behind. Wallace Arnold combated this by buying as many new coaches as it could, and also by rebuilding the ones it already had. And of course, this is where that coach builder in Leeds came into their own. It also took on a policy of buying up other coach operators, which would as well give them extra vehicles. The new vehicles entering the fleet were of Leyland, AEC, Daimler and Bedford manufacture. By 1949, Wallace Arnold had reintroduced continental tours, firstly to Switzerland and France, Italy and the Netherlands. In 1948, the government at the time were keen on nationalisation, nationalising the railways, some of the bus services and the road haulage industry. And Robert Barr quickly sold his road haulage business to British Road Services in 1949. At this time, the fleet was based in a depot at Hunslet Road in Leeds. The original fleet livery of Wallace Arnold was red and ivory. However, in 1950 the red trim was dropped from the livery, and this left the coaches in just the ivory colour scheme, and this was something that was to remain on the coaches during most of the company's existence. In 1957 a coach station in Leeds city centre was opened at the Calls, and this helped reduce a lot of congestion with the coaches in the area. In 1966 a new coach station and maintenance base was opened in Geldred Road in Leeds. Now Wallace Arnold also had a car sales business, and this was also moved to Geldred Road in Leeds as well, and provided ample space. I mean, the site was 10 acres, so it was huge. The car dealing side of Wallace Arnold was Trust Motors, who were an Audi Volkswagen dealership. Now, interestingly, prior to 1980, all coach operations were licensed by traffic commissioners. Now, this meant to operate a tour, you had to register the tour to operate in the same way now that you have to register a bus service. And this was made more complicated by any day trip that was taken from the destination that you reached would also need to be registered too. So, say for example, a trip from Leeds to Torquay would be one registration, And then if you decided you was going to go from Torquay through to Brixham or on one day, and the next day go through to Dartmoor, that would be another 2 registrations. All very complicated stuff, wasn't it? Now, Wallace Arnold did get around this by operating on hire to local operators and paying this operator to use its licence. And this would work in places like London and the South East, where they ran on hire to the likes of East Kent and Royal Blue. Now, there was another problem with registering these tours. Let's go back to our hypothetical Leeds to Torquay tour, shall we? So let's say you're going to put in a pickup point in Leicester and maybe one in Birmingham as well, shall we? So you would receive objections from Middle and Red and possibly Birmingham City Transport for putting these pickup points in their operating area. And of course, anything operating through London with pickup points in there would receive objections from London Transport, who was adamant that you could reach a holiday destination on a London Transport bus. Fortunately, though, the Transport Act of 1980 changed all this and made things a little bit easier. In 1945, Wallace Arnold bought 2 hotels in Torquay. They also bought 2 local coach operators in Devon as well, and this was to form the basis of Wallace Arnold Devon, and this was run as a semi-separate unit. Through its continued acquisitions in the post-war period, Wallace Arnold also picked up various bus operators and had a significant bus operation, in addition to its coach work. These included companies like Hardwicks of Scarborough, Fastly Omnibus in Stanningley, Leeds, and the Kippax and District Fleet also in Leeds. Wallace Arnold would continue to operate these services under their own individual company names. However, the routes in Leeds were sold to Leeds City Transport in March 1968. The Hardwicks route in Scarborough survived well past the deregulation of the bus industry in 1986, but Wallace Arnold management decided that it wasn't really part of their core business and sold it in 1987 to East Yorkshire Motor Services. In 1950, Wallace Arnold sent a coach, which was a duple-bodied Leyland Tiger, over to the World Automotive Fair in New York. And this was seen as a good opportunity to promote their tours and indeed the UK to the rich American tourists of the time. One of the most striking things about the Wallace Arnold coaches was their large orange WA logo, and this was introduced in 1968 and was designed by Ogle, who were the ones who rebuilt one of the DMSs, if you remember, and were also responsible for styling the inside of the London Transport Olympians. Initially, the logo was on a grey and white coach, it being felt that the grey and white of the coach would make the bright orange WA logo stand out a little bit more. And this new livery was adapted by the whole fleet, except for that in Devon, whose main competitor was Grey Cars, who used a grey livery. The coaches based in Devon retained the cream style, but with the new big bold WA logo on them. In 1969, anxious to gain access to the capital of London, with the complicated licensing issues I explained previously, Wallace Arnold took over the long-established company of Evan Evans Tours. Despite being under the Wallace Arnold banner, but they never seemed to be part of the company and fitted a little bit like a square peg in a round hole. In 1983, Wallace Arnold sold Evan Evans to the Insight Group for £40,000. During the 1970s, things started to go a little bit wrong for Wallace Arnold, but then they did for a lot of operators during this time. Car ownership was creeping up, and coach holidays had started to slip a little bit from favour. Coupled to that, Leyland were looking at replacing the Leopard with the Leyland Tiger. And to be fair, by the late 1970s, the Leopard was probably past its sell-by date as a touring coach. When the Tiger was launched, Wallace Arnold placed a large order for Leyland Tigers in 1981. However, Leyland couldn't deliver these buses and offered Leopards instead. Now, it's worth saying at this point that Wallace Arnold had been a fairly loyal Leyland customer since 1925. And when they launched the Tiger at Morocco, no Wallace Arnold vehicle was represented. In late 1981, 3 Leyland Tigers did arrive, but they were all to the wrong specification for Wallace Arnold, and this resulted in Wallace Arnold falling out with British Leyland. Wallace Arnold then moved over to buying Volvos, and no more Leylands entered the fleet, which was a shame as it brought the end of a beautiful relationship crashing down. In 1980, Wallace Arnold were involved with the advent of British coachways. Now, if you'd like me to do a video on British coachways, and I think somebody did ask me for a video on this, I will happily do it. It's a little bit of a complicated beast, but basically it's a lot of operators, coach operators, who were quite often competitors with each other, who were trying to compete under the British Coachways banner with National Express. So straight away you can see a problem with all those competitive coach companies trying to get along to fight National Express, can't you? It was doomed right from the word go. Wallace Arnold painted 3 of its new coaches in British Coachways livery, but withdrew from British Coachways after 12 months. When deregulation loomed in the mid-1980s, National Holidays, who'd always been a huge competitor to Wallace Arnold, became the first to be sold, and this went to the Pleasurama Group, which also owned another competitor of Wallace Arnold, and that was Lancashire-based Shearings. In 1990, Pleasurama decided to drop the National Holidays name in favour of Shearings, which was a name that was really unknown in the key southeast market, and this resulted in a rather large surge for Wallace Arnold. In 1992, history kind of repeated itself. After the problems they'd had in the early 1980s with Leyland and the launch of the Tiger, there were problems with Plaxton. Plaxton had introduced the Premier bodywork, which replaced the long-standing Paramount bodywork, and Wallace Arnold ordered 63 of these new Premiers direct from the drawing board. However, the Premiers were not as good as they looked. There were problems with faulty components within the bodywork and water ingress as well, especially around the boot at the rear end. This resulted in duckboards having to be fitted in coaches' boots to keep luggage above the boot floor, which was often waterlogged. As a result of this, the order for Plaxton the following year was cut back to just 5 vehicles, with the orders going to other bodywork manufacturers such as Van Hool and Jonquière, both of which were built in Belgium. By the mid-1990s, the Barr family was divided in its views and had decided to sell the business, but they were going to split it in its 2 parts, the coach and holiday industry in one part and the motor trade on the other part. These were going to be both sold separately. Initially, it was thought that the company would pass to the Shearings holiday business. However, the successful bid was from a management buyout team. However, the management bid was backed by a venture capital firm, 3i. In 2001, Wallace Arnold made a particular significant purchase, National Holidays, which had been acquired from Pleasurama Group by East Yorkshire Motor Services in the early 1990s. Shearings, who were also under the Pleasurama umbrella, felt that the name of National Holidays didn't have any value, and the name hadn't been used for a while until East Yorkshire Motor Services used it for its own holiday programme. In 2002, Wallace Arnold introduced its very high specification Grand Tourer coaches. These vehicles were painted in a very distinctive black and gold livery and featured a full leather interior, a rear coffee lounge with a floral display and tinted glass partitions. The vehicles used also featured GT registrations, and drivers wore special uniforms that complemented the livery. Both the touring programmes and the vehicles proved incredibly popular. However, this was to be short-lived because in 2005, the venture capitalist backers of the management buyout of Wallace Arnold also purchased Wallace Arnold's main competitor of Shearings and promptly merged the 2 companies, opting to rebrand everything as Shearings and quietly dropping the Wallace Arnold name. The last official day of Wallace Arnold operations was on the 31st of March 2005, and the company did just short of 80 years worth of business, with the Shearings takeover taking effect from the 1st of April Fool's Day 2005. Well, I do hope you enjoyed this slightly unplanned and slightly different episode of Classic Bus Histories, with a look at one of the biggest coaching names that the UK has ever seen. Incidentally, Wallace Arnold also had quite an interesting ancillary fleet as well, including milk floats and this ex-Maidstone Corporation Leyland Atlantean, which featured in a previous video on my channel. That video is called Barn Find Leyland Atlanteans, and I'll try and put a little link up to it in the top right hand corner so you can watch it and see what it's all about. Paul and myself will be returning to the Barn Find Atlanteans next month, which is July 2025. So make sure that you subscribe and don't miss that video. If you did enjoy this video, please like and share it. All money raised from YouTube goes towards the upkeep and restoration of the Southern Counties Omnibus Collection preserved buses. And that makes you an incredibly good egg by watching this video and helping preserved buses. Thank you so much for watching. Bye for now.